Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Um, I'm Christine Delivanis. I lead the Nature Food platform here at Systemiq. We're here to discuss a recent report that we've written on how China's drive for food security may have fundamental and profound impacts on the global agricultural system. I did want to say a very big word of thanks to our partners in this report, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. We will be hearing from a couple of very distinguished speakers shortly, and afterwards our team will be doing a short presentation, and we have ensured to park time for Q&A towards the back end of this hour. Please do insert your questions into the chat on this webinar, and we will do our best to answer them. Before we get into the actual findings of the report, I first wanted to welcome Adam Tooze, whom many of you will know. Adam is a renowned historian. I would let him introduce himself and give you some of his perspectives on this work.
Thank you very much, Christine. I hope you can all hear me well. Good morning from New York. I am indeed a historian, an economic historian, and I have to say that I found this report extraordinarily eye-opening. If you were at the World Bank IMF spring meetings a few weeks ago in Washington, D.C., you will know that all of the talk in global economic policy circles right now is of global imbalances. And that, first and foremost, of course, is a macroeconomic topic. It is aggregate demand, government spending, consumer spending in the aggregate that drive the world economy and the profound imbalances that characterize its current situation. China's huge surplus, America's great deficit. But even as the IMF now recognizes, those huge structural forces in the global economy running to trillions of dollars are also the result of sectoral developments, of industrial policy. And of course, the big drama, and you can't open any newspaper around the world right now without being confronted with it almost on a daily basis, is that Chinese industrial policy has changed the game. It has changed the game because it moves at such gigantic scale. If we're thinking about classic industries like heavy industry, but if we think about more recently, green energy, solar, batteries, cars, it's literally transforming everyday life around the world. And secondly, it moves not just at scale and at global scale. What we are also coming to fundamentally appreciate is that it innovates. China is no longer simply a follower of global trends and of the technological frontier set in the West, but in its own right, a profound innovator. Every single indicator that we have about scientific research, about innovation, points to the fact that China is now emerging as a peer, if not a leader, across more and more areas of R&D. And if you look at these global imbalances shaped as they are by forces of technology and policy, if you look at those imbalances, which most of which, of course, are huge trade surpluses in favor of China, in the current account, a big balancing item, the big balancing items are the material imports to China and, of course, the imports of food, which is what brings us, as Christine was saying in her introduction, which brings us to this fascinating report today. Because if there is an area in which there is room for really profound transformation in China's global position within the world economy, with consequences for the entire system of macroeconomic scope, it is presumably these sectors where China currently is a major importer. And to my mind, the report makes four absolutely essential points with extraordinary exemplary clarity and real force, which as a generalist in these affaires, as somebody concerned with the global balance, will permanently change the way in which I see the world and its future going forward. The first is that as a result of China's opening up since the late 1990s, directly as a result of negotiations over trade, China's trade deficit in food is gigantic. Everyone involved in the market will know the scale of its demand. But this is the result of policy choices. This is not the norm for China. It's the result of a drive to ever greater and higher levels of sophistication in food consumption and a decision to anchor the meat supply chain and above all the pork supply chain on soy, and to source that soy from large-scale global production, notably, of course, in Brazil and the United States. And this is a historic shift. It's unprecedented in Chinese history for China to be as food import dependent as it is. It's an effect of the last 25 years. And when you see it in the graphs, as I'm sure we'll see later on, it is spectacular in its consequences. And we know there is hardly an issue that is of greater significance to the Chinese population, to Chinese politics, than food. If you spend any time there, you know food is everywhere. It is key to the regime's understanding of the world. And that brings us to the second point that the report makes, I think, with both absolute clarity and considerable subtlety, which is that the Chinese political leadership regard the issue of food imports not merely as a macroeconomic matter or a matter of sectoral policy, but as profound central political significance. And we can see across the shifting, subtle shifts in the language of successive plans and policy documents, a greater and greater focus on this issue. It's not new. It's been a matter of concern to the Chinese leadership since the development of the heavy dependence on imports. It's not new to Xi Jinping. The spike, I think, in concern around food security, unsurprisingly, came in 2022 with the Ukraine war. But recent events, shortages in the global fertilizer supply chain and so on, will only have reinforced the sense that this is a key priority area for the Chinese government. And that brings us to the third point that is made, and this is where I think the report is truly innovative and dramatic, is that what we see increasingly, analogously to the way in which the Chinese government moved the pieces into place for industrial policy over a period of more than a decade, and you can map this out, and I'm sure we will see in this very dramatic timeline in just a minute from the Systemiq team, you can map out the way the Chinese government moves the pieces of policy into place around a key policy area. You can see the way that is currently happening in the ag space, in the ag industrial space. And when that happens, what do we know? We know that China will move at scale. It will move with real political emphasis and relentless focus, multiple different actors in the system in the same direction. And we know to expect out of that not just quantitative change, and this we'll see this over phases, but in due course also dramatic qualitative change. And in the food space, of course, that means a huge area of innovation in various types of new protein production. And the Systemiq team will say much more about that in just a minute. And the fourth point that this report makes, which again is hard to unsee once you've seen it, is that this shift in China, which is driven by a deep macroeconomic logic, by a deep political logic, and where we know that the Chinese government on its previous track records has the tools to act. This isn't a Western government where you might wonder whether they do. The Chinese do have the tools to act. It will have dramatic implications for the rest of the world economy and above all, of course, China's major agricultural suppliers. And this, of course, is the message that I'm sure the Systemiq team wants to take forward and to expand into a wider discussion. Because as in the areas of new energy, as in the areas of EV, the biggest mistake that we can make in the rest of the world is not to defend ourselves against China, but not to prepare for the fact that Beijing is absolutely serious in its policy intent. And when they signal as clearly as they currently are, we should take that really seriously. So let me wrap by making three kind of summary comments. If you read this report and you start becoming fascinating with this and you go out into the wider world of other analysis of the current moment, one important thing to say is that though this report, I think, is fascinating and unique in its focus on agricultural innovation, it's not a singleton. This is not an outlier, right? This is a point of view, I think, which has real power in part because it's amplified by messages we're getting from across the agricultural research system in China itself, which is pointing to a future like the one that is mapped out here. This is not a straightforward forecast. I think it's better to understand this report as a kind of scenario planning exercise, as a matrix for thinking about the challenges that are coming our way, and a wake-up call to understand the seriousness, the scale, the dynamism, and a very powerful, I find, powerful analogy in comparison to the sorts of policies which are, as I was saying at the beginning, totally transforming the macroeconomic policy debate in other areas. I think the report is crucial in saying, wake up, smell coffee, understand that if this could happen in the automotive sector, it can clearly also happen in ag as well. And if it has one single and I think crucial message for the entire sector, it is to expect the unexpected. Do not assume that the paradigm that has been shaped in the last 25 years, which after all is one of the great success stories of globalization, the incredible increase in the standard of living in China, the qualitative transformation of the Chinese diet, the building of hugely powerful infrastructures of global trade that have transformed the economies, for instance, of Brazil. Do not expect that that model is the future. Expect continuous change, expect to be looking for continuous challenge, continuous transformation, expect the Chinese government to be a very powerful agent, and innovation coming from China to be one of the dominant factors in the world economy over the next generation. I look forward very much to hearing from the Systemiq team and from colleagues across the space on this report in future, and commend it to you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Adam, for those great words of introduction. I am going to now pass the mic over to my dear colleagues Alex Andreoli and Anna Morser, who did the vast bulk of the writing on this report and the research. I did want to ask them in their introduction, and before they actually get into the slides, to say a few words about how they consulted and worked closely with individuals who are experts in the Chinese agricultural system, many of whom were based in China, because we were very conscious of the perils of trying to write about China purely from outside China. So Alex and Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, this morning, wherever it is where you are. As Christine mentioned, we did want to say a special thanks to those people who are experts in China who helped us along every part of this journey, both from parsing data through to testing hypotheses and conclusions, and deep diving into implications with us. So we're hoping you might be able to hear from one of them later in this session if we can get the connection up and running. But if we aren't able to do that, we do want to acknowledge all of the individuals who helped us along the way. So thank you all to those experts. I'm just going to move us on here. I do want to start us with three main pieces of context, some of which Adam has also already mentioned. The first is demand. So China's population grew 1.5 times since 1980, adding 450 million people. Per capita meat, seafood, and dairy consumption also increased 7-fold. And if you play that math through, total animal protein consumption rose more than 10-fold. Second, import reliance. We show soya here as an illustration, but overall, China went from a minor net agricultural exporter before WTO accession to the world's largest importer by 2019. Today, 83% of soy consumed domestically, which is largely for animal feed, is imported. Those imports are also extremely concentrated, with Brazil accounting for 60% of soya imports and the US for a further 30% before the tariff wars commenced. Third, and related to that point, is shock exposure. Chinese food system faces biological, climatic, and geopolitical risks, of which you see some examples here, like swine flu, drought, and tariff wars. Each of these individually is a significant disruption, but together they constitute a structural vulnerability that Chinese leadership has concluded is incompatible with national security. In response to these mounting pressures, Chinese leadership has elevated food security to a core strategic priority. Over the past 5 years, food security has repeatedly been framed as a matter of national resilience, reflected in formal incorporation into 5-year plans, long-term development strategies, and agricultural modernization agendas. You see but a handful of examples here. Policy language increasingly emphasizes secure, controllable supply for staple foods, protein sources, and critical inputs such as animal feed. The 14th 5-year plan, which covered 2021 to 25, elevated food security as a national economic security pillar for the first time, placing it alongside energy and finance. The latest 5-year plan, which was released just last month, goes materially further. Amongst other things, it targets an additional 50 million tons of grain production capacity. It designates synthetic biotech for new protein development as a strategic priority and targets 85% germplasm self-sufficiency. Biomanufacturing is now framed as a sovereignty level capability. The pattern here is unmistakable. Each successive document raises the ambition, broadens the scope, and moves food from a sectoral concern to a core pillar of China's strategic architecture. Taking all of these signals into account, we wanted to understand what it would mean if China moved on food security the way it has with the other systems it has radically transformed. We show here 2 examples of China's global market share in green technologies. On this chart, the x-axis is not a standard timeline. It's rather counting the number of years from year 0 when the government sets a strategic signal for the relevant industry. In solar PV, which is shown here in yellow, China went from about 10% market share in that year 0 to 70% of global production in 15 years. It has 80 to 95% of component manufacturing upstream as well. Later, with electric vehicles, we see the same trajectory, including in the value chain, but starting from 0% share and compressing that timeline to only 13 years. So I'm sure you're asking, how did China achieve these startling and unanticipated industry transformations? Looking to these examples, we've identified a 5-part playbook that they deploy. Strategic and coordinated vision is at the top, and it is the most important because the other elements of the playbook flow from here. So 5-year plans cascade binding targets from central government to the provinces, to state-owned enterprises, to financial institutions. With the latest 5-year plan, we believe strategic and coordinated vision is now fully in place for food. These priorities are then reinforced across a broader policy ecosystem through 3 main pillars of state support. So financial support includes concessional lending, subsidies, dedicated R&D funding. Then you have policy and regulatory support that provide the frameworks and adapt the environment for new production systems. And finally, you have induced demand, which will vary by industry, but in food, this could be procurement mandates, feed composition standards, and/or dietary guidelines. The final playbook element is an entrepreneurial environment, which comprises dense supplier ecosystems, industry-university partnerships, and fierce domestic competition. We now see examples or statements of intent across all 5 pillars of the playbook. Taken together, we believe we're in year 0 of China's food transformation. On the previous slide, we talked about the playbook elements that China uses to turn strategic intent into industrial transformation. What this slide shows is that this playbook is now moving into execution and biomanufacturing. We're seeing industrial clustering take shape as the mechanism that brings capital, talent, infrastructure, regulation together in one place. We now see evidence of this food industry clustering, which is now visible within these established economic and manufacturing zones. They're not pilots. Rather, we think they're designated growth zones with explicit output targets, dedicated infrastructure, and those really important strong links between universities, startups, and state-backed industry. Based on China's past experience in solar and EVs, this clustering phase is typically the point where experimentation gives way to rapid scale. So to briefly recap, given the importance of food security and the playbook signals we've identified, we believe we're at year 0 of China's food transformation. I'm going to now hand over to my colleague, Alex, who will take you through the potential impacts and the implications of a scale transformation in China's food system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. To understand what this could mean for the future of food systems in China, we modeled the impact of China's transformation. What follows is not a prediction. It's a projection of a plausible future if China chases food security and food system transformation in the same way that it chased energy and transport transformation. Whatever stakeholders in the food system may believe, we think the implications of such a transformation are significant enough that they need to be planned for accordingly. A set of strategies have emerged with the potential to transform China's food system. Obviously, food systems are large and complex systems, and the levers stakeholders, policymakers, producers can take and can act upon are myriad. What we don't want to talk about here is each individual one specifically, but instead the strategy types that these solutions fall into. Conventional strategies rely on extending existing best practice and optimizing incrementally to meet targets that leadership or stakeholders have set. Technological solutions instead involve emerging technologies and are where the learnings from solar and EV can most directly be applied to China's food system transformation. Taking this forward, we considered how the food system might change over the next 3 decades. The story to 2030 is one of target-led optimization. Conventional strategies dominate, with reductions in avoidable food loss and waste, expansion of the poultry and aquaculture sectors, and feed reformulation and livestock efficiencies achieved throughout the value chain. Alternative proteins haven't yet structurally disrupted the market, with the exception here of plant-based dairy, which now captures 20% of the industry. As you play through the impacts of these transformations and these transitions, the critical commodity affected is, as you see on the page, soybean imports. Import demand for soybeans fall by about 23.5 million tons, or 25% of China's current annual imports. When we compare that to recent exports from Brazil and the US, talking here of the period between 21 and 2023, this fall of 25% or 23.5 million tons in soybeans is almost equivalent to annual exports from the US. That's also worth approximately $12 billion US. To offset that slightly, the substitution away from soy as a feed in animal feeds, as a commodity in animal feeds, is towards things like fermented cotton seeds and fermented corn. On the page here, you see that corn imports actually rise marginally as China shifts away from soy. The story to 2040 is one of structural change starting to bite. Alternative proteins, particularly in plant-based and biomass fermented categories, start to reach price parity and really disrupt the conventional protein market. 8 to 16% of all meat consumption is now made up of alternative proteins. At the same time, improvements in both arable and livestock production systems continue to increase outputs. The story thus is that with the reduced demand for animal protein consumption and increased animal protein production, China moves from being an importer of animal proteins today to a major global exporter by 2040, exporting poultry, dairy, eggs, and seafood. Alongside this, soy continues to fall with a further 5% decrease from 2030. By 2050, we see a new equilibrium established, and China has become a global leader in another 21st century defining technology. Cultivated meats, by which we mean lab-grown, animal-based, and genetically identical alternative proteins, have now met price parity and are seriously disrupting the market, with 35 to 55% of all meat demand now met with alternative proteins. At the same time, GM and GE soy and maize has been widely adopted, now accounting for 90% of domestic production. And on the livestock side, 49% of pork production now comes from controlled environment vertical livestock farms. These are incredibly efficient production systems that, while they have serious animal welfare and point source pollution concerns, do allow producers to manage the biosecurity risk associated with pork production and achieve maximal output and efficiencies. From trade perspectives, the story of the 2030s to 2040s continues. Soy import demand continues to fall, and the export of animal-based products continues to rise. The commodity bucking the trend here is maize. As an input now for the growing alternative protein industry, maize imports double. Despite this substitution and drastic increase in maize imports, as a higher yielding crop, China's agricultural footprint globally is projected to fall by over 7 million hectares. As we think through the implications, we considered what it would mean for various stakeholders in the system. Chief amongst these are those in existing producer countries. Within the next 2 decades, China's demand for imports is projected to fall, and some of that will happen in the next 5. Countries whose agricultural economies depend on this market should consider how to respond. We frame this as 5 questions in the report. The first 2 consider how changing demand shifts the balance of value in agricultural assets. How does it change the value of those existing agricultural assets? But critically, how does it change the considerations producers are making when they're considering expansion and future agricultural assets? Does this shifting demand change the dynamic such that we may be investing in stranded assets if we continue to expand? The second 2 questions on the page you see here are about how changing market dynamics, market regulations, standards across the world, including in China, affect how producers can position themselves to access those markets in perpetuity. How can producers meet full traceability, rising standards on deforestation and conversion-free, rising environmental standards, in order to continue to access these lucrative export markets? The last consideration is how governments are preparing rural communities for this structural adjustment. The change is significant and could be disruptive. The more governments do now to prepare communities for it, the better they will fare. We then consider implications for another 3 buckets of actors. The first is the alternative protein industry. China's move into this space signals a paradigm shift. And if they achieve what they have in electric vehicles and solar, we might see drastic reductions in the cost of the biomanufacturing equipment needed to produce alternative proteins. For producers in Europe, the US, Southeast Asia that have led the market so far, this could mean reaching price parity significantly quicker than what they expect. At the same time, China's forays into this industry mean that they are likely going to be competing against Chinese products in potential export markets and should be positioning themselves in preparation for that. For the aquaculture and marine industries, with China's expected expansion of the aquaculture industry and as already the world's biggest producer, the question for us here is whether expansion will be into higher trophic species and where the feed for those new farms and new species will come from. If it comes from increased utilization of byproducts, plant-based products, and alternative proteins, it could be a boon for the environment and for the industry. But if it comes from wild forest fish, from overstressed and already overstressed fishing stocks, it could be a cause for concern. For new supplier countries, the considerations are very similar to the ones for existing producers and involve considerations about the value of agricultural assets and positioning oneself for access to markets in the future. To conclude, we really bring it back to the environmental agenda, the environmental story, and what this could mean for producers and environmental standards the world over. Producers who adapt early will be best placed to succeed. And we hope that this work gives those who are already acting on raising standards, on increasing traceability, on ensuring the highest quality deforestation-free and conversion-free standards are being met. We hope that this gives them the confidence to go further and faster, continue to redirect capital toward productivity and compliance, continue to raise yields on working lands, restoring pasture and restoring degraded working land, and essentially decouple output from land expansion. The things to look out for over the next 12 to 18 months will obviously determine the speed and kind of ambition that China are going after this opportunity. We've mapped elements to look out for against the 5 parts of the industrial playbook that Anna talked about. The first is whether we see targets for alternative proteins, biomanufacturing, feed efficiency, and seed innovation. We've already seen some such targets in feed reformulation, but whether these translate to other parts of the food system will really help us understand how quickly China is going to adopt this. The second is on mandates, quotas, procurement standards, or incentives to create this early demand. Anna spoke about the induced demand element of the playbook, and it's the one where we see the least evidence for at the moment. This is not unexpected and follows the pattern we saw in solar and EV beforehand, where supply was built slightly ahead of demand. But when we see those kind of patterns and those mandates, quotas, procurement standards flow into the food system, that will really indicate a step change in their approach. The third is further evidence around geographic clustering, the likes of which Anna has already spoken about. And then the fourth and fifth are around concessional finance and regulatory changes that support this transition and provide the enabling environment for producers, manufacturers, and stakeholders in China's food system. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to Christine at this point.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Alex and Anna, for the presentation. I'm now going to attempt to moderate the questions that are coming through and maybe direct them either at you guys or in select instances also to Adam. People are welcome to also ask Adam questions for his perspectives on what was presented. The first question that's come through is for Anna and Alex. Which markets will be most impacted if China does shift to exporting food? And what could viable responses be?
Anna, I don't mind to take that if you'd like.
Sure.
I think in the near term, I mean, China is already an exporter of aquaculture products, of seafood, etc. But they will continue to do that, and that role will grow. So there's one element there around seafood and aquaculture. The second, and the new role and their new position will be as an exporter of dairy, poultry, and eggs. In particular, dairy. And so kind of their neighbor countries that at the moment are exporting dairy products to China should be aware of that reversal in position. And that's not to say that China won't continue to export products, especially the bespoke products that may be difficult or impossible to produce in China, thinking salmonids in aquaculture or particular cheeses in the dairy industry. But in the main, China's kind of move into export of dairy and aquaculture products, I think, is what will leave other producers most exposed.
Very good. Thanks, Alex. There's a question for you, Anna, which is, it's about EUDR. So the question is, it comes into effect at the end of this year. Do we have a view on whether these developments help or hinder its implementation?
Thanks, Christine. I think in the main, we're hopeful or optimistic that it will help implementation of EUDR. Also, I mean, a part of broader context is China is increasingly focused on compliance with Brazil's forest code. So we're hoping, and we know there have been recent conversations in Beijing between the EU and the Chinese government about how they can work together to ensure protection of the Amazon, for example. So we are hopeful that these will provide tailwinds rather than headwinds to policies such as EUDR that are trying to stop deforestation. So obviously there's no guarantees, and I think being aware of these trends and the actions that Alex was highlighting around things producer countries can do in light of these potential emerging trends we're identifying all help to hopefully support implementation rather than hinder it.
Very good. Thank you, Anna. So, Adam, there's a question for you. The question is, spiking fertilizer prices have been in the news a lot lately. How do you think these trends in China could interact with current geopolitical tensions and conflict?
I mean, I think it would be great to hear the views of the experts on this call about how they see the fertilizer question. From what I've able to glean, China is an incredibly intensive fertilizer user. Per surface area, it's one of the most intensive. It chases yields by fertilizer application. So this affects China, but I would have thought it simply underlines in big, bold red letters the fundamental point that the report is making, which is that food for China is a security issue. This goes all the way back to the 2000s, when the double decision was made. On the one hand, to open up the Chinese ag market as part of the WTO deal, and on the other hand, then for China to adopt a new post-1980s strategy towards agriculture, which was pushing towards local development on the one hand and commercialization and larger scale on the other. And I think the report is telling us we may be at another key turning point. And you would expect, as in earlier moments of shock, this dual shock, I'm sure it's Ukraine and this put together, to just underline the necessity of these moves. If I might ask back to the panel, I was surprised that we didn't mention soy as a key variable in this shift in terms of industries, because I thought in your report, one of the really striking things was the outlook for soy imports, both from Brazil and the United States to China. Because you focus much more on these export trends, which are very, very striking, and they're reversals of market. But in terms of the big picture ag story, the thing we tend to focus on is soy.
100%, Adam. I think that is one of the major findings. And I think people asked about the impact on producer countries. Yeah, one of the biggest impacts is actually expected to be through the soy pathway for big producing countries. And I do also think that there is a connection to the question of EUDR through this pathway, right? So presumably, if the logic plays out, there's less pressure to expand soy production. Potentially, there's less pressure on the deforestation side in certain countries. That could be a net positive, but also it creates risks for big agricultural powerhouses in Latin America for sure that need to be managed. So yeah, I think we do agree with you. I think it's a very good point of emphasis. There's a question here from Orville, our friend Orville Shell. What would be the best policy for the U.S. to adopt to compete with the scenario the Systemiq report lays out? Difficult question. I don't know. Maybe our team want to start, and maybe we'll ask Adam also for his views.
Yeah, thanks, Orville. Good to have you here. I guess the way I would break it down is, again, by who within the U.S., because obviously the interests of the big soy producers are going to be quite different than the interests of the nascent alternative protein producers, for example. So I think it's going to really depend who you're addressing, and I think what we're trying to say is particularly that an expansion. I mean, in the US, we don't have a deforestation problem so much as a conversion problem, which is grasslands into agricultural land rather than forests into agricultural land. But I think the same logic that we were just talking about in Brazil would apply to those US producers. And then for the alternative protein producers, for example, biomanufacturing, I think, again, it's just a kind of flag that that you might want to accelerate investment into those sectors. Again, possibly from the same logic that China's deploying, in that you'd want to secure supplies or be able to build new export markets, indeed, for biomanufacturing. Obviously, the U.S. is quite food secure already, so the logic is a little bit different, but I think some of that same thinking applies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Anna. Adam?
I mean, I would have thought that one of the things that screams out of the report is innovation. I mean, if you look in the ag space, one of the striking things is just the level of Chinese spending on agriculture. And when I was in China last year, I actually had dealings with the Agricultural University in Beijing, with colleagues there, and one can't help coming away deeply impressed by the level of commitment to research. The report, I think, highlights very nicely this clustering of research, which is, as we have learned surely from industrial policy, the signs of things to come. Like when you bundle the powerhouse capacities of the Chinese state, the incredible hard driving venture capital, innovative potential with the Chinese research potential, and just the scale of the Chinese ag operation, which is gigantic. So there's endless opportunities for experimentation, and their open-endedness towards GM, right? There were very, very few inhibitions on the Chinese side about just going full bore for whatever technological options are there. It's formidable and transformative. And generally speaking, as a liberal economist, I say, for the benefit of everyone. But if you're talking this logic of competition, in other words, how does America hold in there with the Americans, then the Brazilians, I think, who have long treasured and celebrated their ag research legacy, need to step up their game, and they need to double down, they need to track, and everyone essentially needs to follow that template of just not assuming that the current technological horizon is the given horizon, but that there are, truly dramatic, we're not at the end of history. Like we are so far away from that. And that is what I find again and again impressive in the Chinese side, is the willingness to believe. And people say it's incremental, but I mean, it's quantity into quality. If you do enough incremental stuff over a time, you end up with qualitative different outcomes, as we've discovered with batteries, 1,500 kilometer ranges. Like that's incremental, but in the end, it creates a completely different vehicle. So I think that is one of the things I found very interesting about the report, this tracking the research clusters. And if you're asking about competitive policy, America should do the same. It should be doubling down on its grand tradition of land-grant universities and ag research funding, which is obviously not what you'd expect from the current administration. But in future, that will be the way to go.
Very good. And if I can just add one point, because we've had a few conversations about some of these questions in terms of how should other countries react. And I think what I would say at a high level is that, the report sets out a potential pathway and lays out the indicators to look for in terms of measuring progress against that pathway. I think we would say that all implicated parties, whether it's the US, whether it's Brazil, whether it's the European Union, for different reasons, should keep track of what's going on, because that will give us a sense of, are we on this pathway? Are we below it, or are we above it? And what can we interpret about the speed of change and the implications? There's a question I'm going to pass to Alex, which you referenced this topic a little bit during your presentation. But the question is, on the topic of procurement standards, do you think a future drop in imports might open a window for China to raise the bar on its suppliers' socio-environmental compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that you can see starting to happen already. We've seen, as Anna mentioned, discussions around the China-Brazil soy trade and how China would like to raise standards, is exploring how standards might change, is looking at things like EUDR on what other kind of jurisdictions have done on the issue, and what they could potentially lift into the Chinese market. And while the kind of trade flows we're talking about are minimal today, as this kind of transition starts to bite, and as Rodrigo, I think, who asked the question, has pointed out, with the fall in imports, it might give Chinese policymakers the kind of headspace, the room to make more ambitious decisions on imports, so on raising standards. So yes, absolutely, I agree. I think there is an opportunity here to raise standards globally with this changing import dynamic.
If I can add one point, Alex, under a free trade logic, then the key dimension on imports is cost. Under more of a competitiveness logic, then arguably some of these standards become also a way to develop, your own industry. So I think it's in a way a little bit ironic, but we may have, we need to watch the space, right? But we may expect to have some increases in environmental standards as countries try to also develop their own independence from others, right, on key commodities and key inputs. There's a question here, maybe Adam, you have a perspective. Will ASEAN countries sufficiently benefit from China's drive for food security? Will they benefit at all? Think collaboration in technology, exports like rice, outsourcing of manufacturing where China has become uncompetitive. Do you see it going in that direction?
Well, so I was doing some research ahead of our session today. I was looking back to the 1990s, and Lester Brown's big paper, the famous one, "Who Will Feed China?" actually was posed against the backdrop of anxiety about ASEAN food supplies, right? The worry was that China, as it grew, would essentially draw down on the rice economy of wider Asia and would create massive and intolerable pressure. And we know that turned out to be a gloomy Malthusian scenario. I would have thought that with regard to ASEAN, some of these spillover logics are clear, right? There is a key strategic turning point here. Like China has two, at least to put it very crudely, one mode of operating is social and environmental standards dumping, and another is raising the bar. And China is Janus-faced on this, right? They are a absolutely deforestation concerned actor at home. There's nothing they prioritize more than laying out forests. How do they relate to Cambodia, which is a very different kind of relationship? And so I think it's a matter of power dynamics. It's going to be case by case, but overall, the dynamism of the food supply story on the Chinese side removes that ancient fear that somehow China will be the big hole that sucks everyone else in. But the power logic of China's actions in that sphere is case by case, and it's a question of self-strengthening on the side of its partners to decide what kind of deals they end up with. Because we see the whole gamut of interactions, whether we're looking at Indonesia, whether we're looking at Thailand, whether we're looking at Cambodia. And it really is, it's not a given that you end up with a bad deal and on the end of an exploitative relationship, but you certainly risk it. And China, of course, also has a question of internally policing bad actors within China's own system, notably in its near abroad and in the Chinese Southwest. So I think this is an open-ended answer to a question which I don't think has a clear answer, but it is worth underlining that 1990s fear of a kind of comprehensive Asian food crisis seems quite remote from the scenario you're describing. That doesn't seem to be the world that we're in at all. And that's of course first order important.
Very good. I'm going to throw one back to you again, Adam. A really good question here, which I've wondered myself about this for a while. You've mentioned before that US and EU have been very slow to notice and respond to the speed of Chinese transformation in energy.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was? And do you think there's anything to suggest that this response might unfold more quickly?
Yes, I mean, it really is surely one of the great historic ironies. If you look at the energy space in 2010, quite unambiguously, Europe is leading the world, right? Germany, for heaven's sake, has half the installed solar capacity. And there is, a real catastrophic failure. And I think on the one side, it's distraction. The Eurozone crisis doesn't help. The lack of investment generally, the Draghi report kind of narrative of Europe finds. And it's not a China-specific problem. It's just a general problem. And you can't, after all, fault, the US generally for failing to see the story coming. After all, Tesla is the model for BYD. But the difference is, and again, you could see the Europeans treated, and the Japanese even more, treated Tesla as an oddity, whereas the Chinese took it as the model of the future, ran with it, and then chased like crazy down that route. But the more general point is that this is a civilizational shift. Right? So there are. Sorry, for some reason I'm being scammed. I think it's the matter of being on these systems at the same time. The historic shift that we're undergoing in terms of the center of global research, as a historian of the last 150 years, GDP numbers don't capture the scale of the shift as dramatically as the shift in the center of research activity does. So the rise of China, I think, is more dramatically registered in the science space than it is even in the GDP space. And it doesn't surprise me that the West has had difficulty wrapping its head around the sheer staggering transformation. Even in the university that I teach at Columbia, the Chinese presence is everywhere. 30% plus of our students are either Asian American or Chinese. And yet the university actually has a hard time processing the fact that we're essentially still living the Chimerica dream, right? The Chimerica is nowhere more present still than in private universities. So I don't fault that historic. I mean, it's a problem for industrial policy, but it's not surprising. It would, however, be surprising if we were surprised again. And that's why I find this report so compelling, because it's saying maybe the first time round, you could say, this is a surprise. But now we know what the Chinese playbook is, and we know how seriously you have to take it. And there is no excuse for repeating that kind of error, given the kind of report and the kind of research that you're able to produce, and how open China is. As you say, this was done with Chinese colleagues, so there's no secret about any of this. It's
Yes.
not furtive or backdoor. It's proudly
Indeed.
announced as program.
Thank you, Adam. I've got two last questions. If there are any burning questions on anyone's mind, please do get them into the chat now, because we're going to be timing out at the top of the hour. Alex, the first one's for you. So somebody has very astutely commented that the macro logic, the food security logic driving China's shift in today's world cannot be seen as unique to China. Might we see other countries undergoing something similar or thinking in similar ways? Can you talk a little bit about that? Obviously countries vary in terms of their relative food dependency and how they might react.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And the short answer is yes. I think you might see this logic of food security and national security intertwining and becoming more and more prominent, and more countries looking at it seriously as something that they'll want to tackle. How specific countries go about tackling it will vary, as you say, depending on what they're importing, to what extent, what shifts are they exposed to, how much fertilizer, which is, as Adam mentioned, the big question at the moment, how much fertilizer they're importing and from where. But I think what you might see coming out from China is this tech-led approach, using biomanufactured ingredients, the bio-industries, to replace not just food, but also animal feeds, replacing inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And the development of kind of domestic seed industries to replace the needs to import those from abroad. And so kind of a nearshoring, a reshoring of much of the food value chain through 21st century technologies. And biomanufacturing is one of them. It leverages off kind of the renewable energy push. These industries will require lots of energy, and which can be low temperature and electrified. It will leverage AI technologies and developments in more computing power. And so, yes, I think that macro logic you could apply to other countries. You will see it bite more often and kind of come to the fore. How it plays out in different countries, as I say, will vary depending on the country, and also the industries that they've already invested in. China is looking at biomanufacturing for one reason, because of the fact they've already captured large amounts of the amino acid pharmaceuticals market through biomanufactured products. And so it leverages kind of expertise that they've already developed. So the question we should be asking is, if India are going down a food security logic, what have they already become the world's best at? If the EU is going to go down the food security logic, where is the EU best placed to achieve that?
Very good. Thank you, Alex. Maybe Anna, to wrap us up here, a great question. Will China becoming a net exporter of food products be the answer in terms of hunger in the global south and developing countries?
Thanks, Christine. I mean, that's a great question. And I think my answer here would actually build on what Alex was just laying out, which is that you stack all these technological developments together alongside renewable energy. And I think what we could see, and we've been exploring this in other work with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation on the future of food systems, is we might see a much more distributed production footprint than we've seen previously. So I think there's really interesting potential in there. And it does make me optimistic, but obviously it's not going to be tomorrow. I think we need to see a lot of these trends play out, but I think there's real potential for both achieving greater food security in major countries, but also in smaller countries around the world that have been even more import dependent.
The big region presumably is Africa, right? The vast majority of the undernourished people are. And I was thinking about that quite hard as reading your report. It's like, if you're going to divert that feed supply chain to anywhere, surely it will be an increasing protein consumption in Africa.
Indeed. Adam, maybe in the last minute or so that we have, and then I will close this webinar. There's a very thought-provoking question here in the chat, which says China was able to grow in a world order whose institutions are now under attack. If instability that we see today continues to prevail, does that change their growth prospects?
Well, it's not good for anyone's growth prospects, I think it's fair to say. But this is where I think the argument of this report on standard setting is so important, because I don't see China as a macro scale hegemon. I think that's their project in the current moment. But are they interested in supply chain stability and quality and standard setting at that level? They already are. They're already doing it, right? So if China may not be the immediate successor as a hegemonic power, but as an ordering power, as a creator of stable supply chains and industrial standards, that kind of micro level ordering, I think this is where this kind of report is extremely interesting. Because again and again now we see de facto, say in any of the renewable energy space, who sets the standards? It's the Chinese that set the standards. And I think we're going to see something more and more of that type in these sectors. So it won't replace the 1990s 2000 model, but it will create new types of ordering along these technological chains. And in those areas, we should expect China to be in the absolute front rank, if probably in many areas the dominant player, replacing the EU, if you like. Less Brussels effect, more Beijing effect.
Very good. Thank you, Adam. I think I'm going to close us off now. Hopefully this has been a useful presentation of the work, and there's been some good discussion and questions, and really appreciate, Adam, your contributions and your support here. We did want to apologize on behalf of Schengen Fan, who was not able to join from China due to some technical issues we were having. But I'm sure for individuals who want to reach out to him, he will be happy to speak to you about his perspectives on, on this work. I think from our side, again, a huge thanks to Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their partnership and support. I think you've gotten a sense that we are interested in nonlinear systems change. Let's call it like that. That's what our company is most interested in and most fascinated about. And I think we've had a really good conversation today on how this may play out in the context of the food system and what China's role may be in it. So we look forward to interacting with many of you in the coming weeks and months about this topic and hopefully many others. Best wishes to everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.